Congratulations.
Oh, great. Oh, and Sophie's video is working. Okay, great. So let's get started. We're already a little late. So welcome to this roundtable titled New Perspectives on New Orleans. And before we start, I think that Cécile Vidal would like to say a few words.
Good morning. I should say good afternoon here on this side of the Atlantic. I'm Cécile Vidal, a French historian of colonial New Orleans. I will take the floor for a very brief moment before the session starts. Unfortunately, Emily Clark, who was supposed to participate in this session, cannot be with us today, but she asked me to say a few words about Sylvia Frey, emeritus professor at Tulane University, who passed away on June the 23rd. We would like to dedicate the session to Sylvia. Emily, who was like a daughter to Sylvia, should have been the one talking about her. But I had the privilege to meet Sylvia more than 20 years ago when I started to work on my book on French New Orleans. She welcomed me in her home during my annual trips to New Orleans, and we became friends over the years. I'm not going to talk about a brilliant scholarship and the tremendous importance of a contribution to early American history. I would only say that when we visited New Orleans to work in the archives or to go to a conference, all of us here benefited from a sharp mind, insatiable intellectual curiosity, impeccable moral rectitude, and warm generosity towards younger colleagues. If the field of early New Orleans history has flourished in the last decade or so, it's also because Sylvia encouraged us and represented for us the perfect role model of an academic. As she was so intensely engaged in the struggle against racial and gender discrimination, she would have been very pleased to see this gathering of women discussing the early history of a city which was very dear to her heart. Let's make this session a tribute to Sylvia and her exemplary work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Cécile. That was very beautiful. I actually never met Sylvia, but she was clearly an outstanding scholar, and it sounds like she was also an amazing colleague, so she'll be missed. Okay, so my name is Mélanie Lamotte, and I'm an assistant professor at Tulane, working on French Louisiana, and I'll be the chair of this panel. So first, I will introduce our three speakers for today. Second, each speaker will briefly talk about their recent book, so I'm going to give you approximately 5 minutes. And then we'll address a set of pre-circulated questions. And finally, there'll be an open Q&A, and so you can write your questions in the chat. I don't think that there is a raise your hand feature here. So yeah, if you could write your questions in the chat, that would be great. So it is my honor to introduce our three speakers for today. Jessica Mary Johnson is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University and a fellow at the Hutchins Center for African American Studies at Harvard University. She is also the director of Life X Code, Digital Humanities Against Enclosure. She's a historian of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. Her book, Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy and Freedom in the Atlantic World, is a recipient of 4 prestigious book prizes. Her work has appeared in multiple venues, including Slavery and Abolition, the Journal of African American History, and the William and Mary Quarterly. As a historian and Black studies scholar, Johnson researches Black diasporic freedom struggle from slavery to emancipation. As a digital humanist, Johnson explored the ways in which the digital and social media disseminate and create historical narratives, in particular comparative histories of slavery and people of African descent. She's a recipient of multiple research fellowships and awards, for example, from the Mellon African American Digital Humanities Initiative at the University of Maryland, or the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Cécile Vidal is professor or directrice d'études of history at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. She's a social historian of colonial empires, the slave trade and slavery in the Atlantic worlds from the 17th to the 19th centuries. In addition to Histoire de l'Amérique française, co-edited with Gilles Havard, she is the author of the award-winning book, Caribbean New Orleans, Empire, Race, and the Making of a Slave Society, published in 2019, and the editor and co-editor of 10 collective volumes, including 2 volumes on early New Orleans and Louisiana, titled Louisiana, Crossroads of the Atlantic Worlds, and New Orleans, Louisiana, and St. Louis, Senegal, 2 mirror cities in the Atlantic world, co-edited with Emily Clark and Ibrahim Mathieu. Her 2 most recent collective volumes, which were released in September and October, are Une histoire sociale du Nouveau Monde and Les mondes de l'esclavage, co-edited with Pauline Ismard and Benedicta Rossi. She's currently working on a new research project on suicide, the slave trade and slavery in the French and British Atlantics in the 18th and 19th centuries. And last but not least, Sophie White is professor of American Studies, Africana Studies, History, and Gender Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She's published 3 books and 20 articles and essays, and is completing a digital humanities project on slave voices, which is due to launch in the spring with the Omohundro Institute. She's won 2 fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, among other awards, and her most recent book, Voices of the Enslaved, Love, Labor, and Longing in French Louisiana, is the recipient of 7 book prizes, including the James Wiley Prize from the American Historical Association and the Frederick Douglass Book Prize for the most outstanding book on slavery. So please join me in welcoming our speakers for today. So now I'm going to, so I don't know if you can hear those echoes. Can you hear those echoes? I wonder if we should stay muted when we're not talking, maybe. So first of all, I wanted to ask you maybe to introduce your books, your recent books, yes, there is an echo. Okay, great. So I wanted to ask you to introduce your recent book very briefly. I'm going to give you 5 minutes each. Cécile is actually the first person on my screen. So would you like to start?
Okay, thank you very much for this generous introduction. So Caribbean New Orleans is a comprehensive social history of New Orleans over the first 2 generations after the port city founding by the French in 1718 to 1769, when the Spanish started to rule the Louisiana colony for good. The book argues that it's more accurate to view 18th century New Orleans as a Caribbean port city rather than a North American one. Its late founding, its position within the French Empire, and its connection with Saint-Domingue explain why the interplay of slavery and race profoundly informed its society, profoundly shaped its society from the outset. Indeed, the Louisiana capital quickly found its place within a greater Caribbean that was already decisively shaped by racial slavery. Located at the northern margin of this greater Caribbean region, French New Orleans looked to the south, and especially to Saint-Domingue. The West Indian Territory was well on the way to becoming France's richest colony and the colonial center that drove the French Atlantic Empire when New Orleans was first established. Consequently, Louisiana authorities and settlers sought to emulate the fast emerging Pearl of the Antilles. As the Company of the Indies employee Marc-Antoine Caillot stated, they tried to create, I quote, a second Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue not only provided Louisiana authority and settlers with the inspiration to establish a slave society and economy, but also offered them a set of means and practices to do so. Pork planters from the French Lesser Antilles did not move to the mainland as Barbadians did from Barbados to South Carolina, bringing their system of racial slavery with them. But in the Mississippi colony, as Louisiana was often called at the time, the transference of ideas and practices occurred because the French crown played a crucial role in the circulation of slave laws between colonies. The racial conceptions of West Indian officials and settlers were disseminated through the Code Noir and mediums such as books and correspondence. Since ships navigating between Europe or Africa and New Orleans necessarily had to make a stop at Saint-Domingue, all migrants from France also experienced the intricacy of a slave society first-hand in the island before their arrival in the Mississippi Valley. Over time, these intercolonial movements intensified and came to exercise a great influence on local social dynamics. In such a transatlantic and imperial context, the commitment of local authorities and colonists to the slave system never wavered, despite the vicissitude their settlements underwent. Although French Louisiana struggled to develop a full-fledged plantation economy, the colony succeeded in establishing a slave society very early on that was profoundly shaped by race. With such an argument, Caribbean New Orleans seeks to contribute to the comparative historiographies on port cities, slave societies, urban slavery, and racial formation. The book conceives of race as a political resource that was used not only to justify, but most of all, to operate the slave system, and views racialization as a dynamic and protean process. It demonstrates that slave societies only needed rudimentary notions of race to become racialized, not fully formalized and systematized scientific racist theories. Racialization is viewed as both a top-down and a bottom-up process that needs to be apprehended in all its dimensions. Besides the legal and social treatment of interracial unions and the status of free people of color, on which most social historians of early American societies focus, the book analyzes the multiple mechanisms by which race insinuated itself in every domain of social life, not only in the intimate sphere of sexuality and the family. In so doing, Caribbean New Orleans also contends that historians need to move away from a comparative history of racial slavery in the Western Hemisphere that contrasts the Caribbean and North America as two distinctive models. Instead, they should consider all American colonial and slave society as part of a continuum. Last but not least, the book situates early North America history on the periphery of Caribbean history, and as a result contributes to a broader historiographical trend aimed at decentering North America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cécile, for this very informative presentation. Who'd like to go next?
I'm happy to do that. I'll be so I suppose what I'll say is that primarily I see the book as a methodological intervention, but hopefully that has some other results as well. And just to say that, you know, like I've been working on these archives for, you know, like Cécile, for over 20 years. And what I was hoping to do with it was a couple of things. One of them was to rethink and reinterpret what an autobiographical slave narrative looks like. So I wanted to make a sort of one intervention about sources, about archives, but also about looking elsewhere and not being bound by the Anglo and the Protestant model of thinking about what a slave narrative looks like, you know. And so that was very important. But of course it emerges from my interpretation of the archives themselves, in that I work on slave trials like many of us do when we're dealing with slavery, because Louisiana is just extraordinary, and in fact French colonies are, but Louisiana particularly so, in having trials in which enslaved opponents testify as accused, as victims, occasionally as victims, as witnesses, etc. And as I was revisiting those trials, realized that there is a lot of scope for the deponent to go off track, to go on tangents, to add details that have nothing to do very often with the trial, but which they speak and which then gets recorded. So much of the book was also having me think about legal culture, legal procedure, literary analysis in moments when we find dialogue left intact, very rarely, but occasionally, passages in Creole, etc. And so, and part of my thinking about or rethinking about these sources was to, first argue that these are autobiographical narratives because they give us a sense of the perspective of the person speaking, their worldview. We have an access point to their worldview. It also means that the whole aspect of empirical evidence, using these trials to find out what happened, etc., the facts sort of receded in importance, because what I really wanted to think about was what was being said, not so much whether what was being said was an accurate reflection or had could be corroborated elsewhere. So putting very much the emphasis on the voices, and as the end product fell into shape and has fallen into shape, it's also become a story of specific individuals. So each one of those individuals is foregrounded. Occasionally they're a pair, such as the final chapter on these two lovers, Jean-Baptiste and Quenet, which I still think of as just a love story, heartbreaking one in many ways, but that each time allows us to think about themes, in that case, marriage, household formation, and each chapter trying to deal with something that might illuminate aspects of early New Orleans. So I'll just leave it there, except to say that I'm interested in, I'm interdisciplinary. My PhD's in art history. So for me, history and archives that are means of thinking across disciplines. And so the first book was about using material culture to think about race. This book was really thinking about legal culture, legal history, literary analysis, also material culture to think about slavery and individuals. And those are the types of things that I tend to be drawn to.
Great, thank you so much, Sophie. Jessica?
Okay, thank you all so much for having me and for this gathering, and for the dedication to Sylvia Frey, who is just a phenomenal scholar and a true advocate. I'm coming from Baltimore, of course, land of Piscataway, Susquehannock, and Eastern Band of Cherokee, as well as other peoples, and we, of course, are speaking on the land that speaking of the land that was what's kind of known as Babancha, land of many tongues, Tunica, Choctaw, Natchez, Huma, and so many others. And so there's a kind of groundedness in our work that I think is so critical, and the intersections for me, both with Saint-Domingue and with imperial structures of testimony, and with African and indigenous who make up, and I argue create, I would argue really kind of create the frameworks and the life ways that that erupt out of the Gulf Coast. We're here, I feel like to witness and to be part of work that really honors that, and that's in a lot of ways where Wicked Flesh comes out of. So Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World is very much a book that is centered around African women and women of African descent, and the ways that Black women, which I use as a way of describing both of these, categories of origin, ethnicity, gender, et cetera, Black women have navigated the rise of slavery, particularly in the 18th century. So it's a study of living across empires. Much of it is about the French Atlantic. It does move into the Spanish speaking world as well, and a brief touch into the U.S. Empire as they acquired Louisiana Territory, just a touch. So it's about overlapping empires, certainly. It is also about the ways that diaspora operates, and how that looks and was participated in and actualized in practice. So it moves from Senegambia through the Caribbean into and ends up in New Orleans in that capacity. And it is also very much about the ways that intimacy and kinship are such critical vectors in the lives of African women of African descent in this period, both in how African women, with the context of Senegambia as a focus, are already navigating a world of kinship, of community, of various kinds of societies, various intimate formations, various social relations, whether that's rooted in Islam, whether that's rooted in older practices with kind of, African versions of Catholicism, brought and derived from the Portuguese in part, whether that's formations that are, sort of, nominally linked to either of these and really emerge from other parts of West and West, further into off the coast lifeways. It is about the ways that intimacy and kinship are very much ways of understanding the world and ways of navigating for greater autonomy, security, and safety, even before the encounter and for some, the crossing across the Atlantic. But it's also about the ways that intimacy and kinship are vectors through which empire, French Empire in this case, but also the kind of conglomerate of empire and ways of thinking about Black women's sexuality, freedom, race and mixed race. All these are coalescing, shifting, and really cohering in this 18th century moment. It's about the ways that those are also, intimacy and kinship are also ways that empire sought to place constraints and enclose freedoms, place controls over labor, corral Black women's reproductive capacity towards the greater production of plantation products. So all of these things are mixed together, and they're also changing. So they're also themselves revising over the course of this 18th century period. And so as African women are engaging with a world that is being created around them, I wanted to take very seriously that they had something to contribute and to say about these processes as they developed, and that their imposition and their determination and their refusal in some cases to abide by these strictures, their resistance to these strictures, and in some cases their embodiment of them, because there are also, messy aspects of that as well, also shaped and reshaped how freedom was made and defined and understood and legislated over this period. And so Wicked Flesh is very much about that. It's a history of Black women who experienced the contours of bondage and freedom as slavery and the slave trade began to unfold. It describes their everyday fight for some sense of humanity, and it owes everything really to scholarship and scholars who have been telling Black diasporic women's story. History is a history of freedom, and the nature of this work is unique. So in Brenda Marie Osby's poem Madhouses, a woman named Félicité describes the body behavior of a cohort of irreverent and defiant New Orleans Black women who are dancing and daring their way through New Orleans. And Félicité warns that these, quote, madhouses have many secrets, but, quote, I am telling only as much as you can bear. Scholars of Black women's lives have engaged in similar dances of irreverence and defiance, revealing the known and reveling in the unknown, pushing the boundaries of narrative and the archive. And Wicked Flesh would be impossible without this rich research on women in slaveholding West and West Central Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean. This scholarship began and continues a difficult task of placing labor lives and discourse about Black women at the center of plantation production and the post-emancipation society. Wicked Flesh is an attempt to continue in this tradition, centering African women and women of African descent as complicated, carnal, and flawed subjects whose lives nonetheless mattered. So the chronology is 1685 to 1809, 1810, and that gives some sense of some of the contours of the work and what's getting tackled
Well, thank you so much. I mean, you've written 3 absolutely outstanding books, and it's a real honor to chair this panel. So I'm going to ask our 25 viewers to start writing their questions in the chat. And we are going to address the pre-circulated questions. So the first 2 questions are a little personal. I guess everybody would love to get to know you a little better. So the first question was, why did you decide to study New Orleans in particular?
I can start. So after my dissertation on the social history of the 6 French villages in the Illinois country, which were located midway between Canada and Lower Louisiana and borrowed traits from both colonial models, I felt the need to study another kind of social formation and to switch from rural settlements located in the North American heartland to a port city. I just went down the Mississippi River to work on New Orleans, but I had in mind the model of French urban community studies written by eminent French historians of early modern France, such as Pierre Goubert, Maurice Garden, or Jean-Claude Perrault. However, the port city, New Orleans, was very different from the French cities they studied for 3 reasons. First, it was founded very late, at the beginning of the 18th century. It was located at the juncture of North America and the
Cécile, ton microphone a des problèmes, je crois.
Your internet is bumpy. We can't hear you anymore. Cécile? No, I think there is a problem with your microphone. We can't hear you anymore.
Yeah.
Whoa, now it's perfect. Okay. Oh no. No, it's not. No, it's not working.
Qu'est-ce qu'on voudrait être à la Nouvelle-Orléans en ce moment sans problème technique?
I know, right? This is very annoying. Cécile, yeah. I mean, you may want to maybe try to leave the meeting and come back. I don't know if it's your internet connection or microphone that's not working. Okay, so I think she'll come back. Would like one of you maybe like to take over for now, or?
We're all being so polite. I want to know why Jessica's working on New Orleans. I'd say probably totally accidental. I am a native of another former French colony, Mauritius, in the Indian Ocean. And when I was looking for a topic, I was for my dissertation, I was thinking, well, you know, I could work on New France, or I could work on Louisiana, and I felt that Louisiana was still the neglected one, and that was why I stayed working on this is a different matter. And I think just to sort of echo some of Cécile's sort of trajectory, she began with her magisterial study of the Illinois country that we still want to see in print fully or in English for those of us who'd like to teach it. But I think I also started there with those archives. And so I, even though the dissertation of the first book also then, you know, so I think we're some of the few who actually do both lower and upper Louisiana. Many scholars will just focus on New Orleans and that sort of greater lower Louisiana area. And that's still very important to my work. I think starting out up there just gave a different perspective. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sophie. So Cécile, I guess now, can we try again?
Yes. Does it work? Do you?
Yes, it's working. Awesome.
So I was talking about the specificities of New Orleans. It's the time of its foundation, its location, and the fact that it experienced several changes of sovereignty. So my initial goal, because of that, was to analyze its creolization, meaning its transformation over time through the succession of French, Spanish, and English, and then US rule. But it took me so much time to collect all the French primary sources that I decided finally to focus on the French regime. And this decision was salutary in the sense that it helped me to distance myself from the main US approach to colonial history at the time. 20 years ago, many US historians of 18th century Louisiana had an implicit theological agenda. They focus on the impact of the succession of change of sovereignty that Louisiana experienced, because what interested them most was to understand what happened at the time of the Louisiana integration within the United States. Their main historical framework of reference was early North American US history, that is a proto-national or national history setting. In contrast, the decision to focus on the French regime helped me to take more easily the Atlantic and imperial turn. And rather than integrating Louisiana history within US history, I wanted to replace Louisiana history within the history of the French Empire and the Atlantic world at the time of its foundation. I decided to write a cis-Atlantic history of French New Orleans, that is to study how the relations New Orleans maintained with the rest of the French Empire and the Atlantic world shaped its society. Consequently, my aim was less to dialogue with Louisiana historiography than to use New Orleans as a case study to contribute to the historiography of early colonial empires and the Atlantic world. As my research sub-question had to do with the specificity of urban slavery and the process of racialization, one can wonder if it would have made more sense to work on Cap Français in Saint-Domingue or Saint-Pierre, Martinique, or Kingston, Jamaica, since New Orleans remains such a small, remote, insignificant port city throughout the 18th century. But in my view, what gives heuristic value to New Orleans as a case study is once again its lace foundation and location at the western edge of the French Empire. Since the Louisiana capital was created decades after what became the most prominent French and British port cities, New Orleans emerged under very different circumstances when the Atlantic world was marked by an advanced integration, the consolidation of several European empires, the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, the multiplication of slave societies, and a general but differentiated racialization. And thus for me, New Orleans, because of that, constitutes an ideal place to evaluate the impact and ongoing Atlantic trends on new colonial societies.
Well, thank you so much, Cécile. It's amazing. Jessica?
Yes. So I came to studying New Orleans through a broader interest in studying the history of slavery and African diaspora, definitely, but really very interested in what it means to build kinship and community in the most dire circumstances. And so the ways that, and what this might mean for Black women and girls, for those identified or understand themselves as women, because we know gender is so expansive. And I love this conversation because it reminds me that so many of the ways that we sometimes come to our work are historiographic, or personal, or both. And so for me, there is, like Cécile, there's absolutely a historiographic piece that is about the ways that mixed raceness had been taken up in broadly, whether that's in history, literature, sociology, et cetera. My first encounters doing research were as a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow in African American studies at WashU. So my encounters with New Orleans very early on were very interdisciplinary. And so the ways that both sort of mixed raceness were being taken up in a particular early 2000s moment, which is a manifestation of a late 90s moment, and the ways that the free women of color, right? And I say that in quotation marks, and we know that that's been challenged and is being challenged. Emily Clark is not here, but Strange History of the American Quadroon, Lisa Z. Winters and her work on the mulatto concubine, like that these are formulations that are themselves fraught and constructions of this encounter of slavery and empire and colonialism. But in the historiography, the legacy of that is very clear. So the free person of color often is figured as masculine or assumed to be masculine, and is a figure that is a kind of self-conscious, rational individual, bourgeois upstart, right? Julien Raymond is like kind of prototypical, like the free man of color. Not Toussaint, interestingly enough, but Julien Raymond. And on the other side, you have the free woman of color, and I talk about this a little bit in the conclusion, that is in the New Orleans context is figured in two different ways, either Marie Laveau or Henriette Delille, and bifurcated, not by New Orleans folks, from beyond, of course, and is of a particular phenotype, has a particular kind of licentiousness that's attributed to them, that is either parasitic or or desirable, and is also a kind of strange, like does not quite belong according to the figuration figure. And I found both of those unsatisfying as to the reality of what enduring and experiencing a world in bondage would have been like and might have been like. And so encountering that, and then encountering more work in African diaspora history, in African history, not only Ira Berlin's amazing work, but also Michael Gomez's work, Gwen Hall's work, the work around the Signars, of which Hilary Jones' work has been so instrumental, began to make clear and continue for me to clarify that the complicated dynamics of kinship and community are such that we have to have better models for understanding how intimacy and kinship operate within a broadly of African descent diasporic world that's in formation. We have to do a better job of thinking about these in historical paradigm, and we have to bring women into it, and not as like add women and stir, but think about what does this world look like from the context of African women and women African descent, and how might that actually reshape how we understand everything, whether it's geography, whether it's aesthetic practices, whether it's ideas of freedom, or even temporality. Like how do we go from that perspective? And so a lot of that was my interest, and all of that is sort of like historiographic and academic. My interest in New Orleans is a deep interest in how New Orleans for me is a template for really rethinking what is possible when resisting empire, resisting racist enclosures, and imagining what a new world might look like. So everything from the Natchez revolt all the way up to, all the way up to like the present, but thinking of in the context of where the period I'm interested in, the 1811 St. John's Baptist Parish, German Coast uprising, Charles Lalonde's uprising, everything. And there's so many moments that are really critical moments, not just for Black history or for the Gulf Coast, but for the entire, what becomes the United States. And we don't talk about New Orleans or the Gulf Coast that way. We talk about it as or if we talk about it all, it's sort of on the periphery, it's on the side, but it's actually like, and I say this refrain often on social media, that Black New Orleans is actually the center of the world. And what would it mean if we actually thought of it that way and really wrote into and tried to learn and truly understand what some of these dynamics are? So I have a very, in some ways, like personal and deep commitment to how to think about Black New Orleans as very, very much a motor for how to really reshape all of our societies in a more just and humane capacity.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. So I'd like to encourage the viewers to start posting their questions in the chat. And we're going to move to the second question. So the second question was, can you tell us about the ways in which your identity, and by this I mean your cultural origins, your gender, your national background, etc., have shaped the ways you've approached the history of New Orleans? So it's kind of related.
Can I start with that one? Because I was thinking of Jessica's point about, you know, the center of the world, which is, of course, another way of decentering the narrative. And I was making me think about Emily Clark and Dan Osner, who both very early on were writing pieces about, you know, not leaving New Orleans and Louisiana at the margins as it is in so much historiography. But the other thing it made me think of is I am from another former French colony, and that was the center of my world. And so and I have to say that I mean, again, this is personal, when I land at that airport, or the first time I came in on the train from Chicago, I mean, I arrive and I feel like I see the palm trees and I'm just, you know, I'm back in the center of my world in many ways. And I'm also, in terms of informing it, I mean, I think we're all very self-conscious about our particular experiences of something like that. Certainly I am, but I am also, I'm a native French speaker of French, Creole, Mauritian Creole, and English at the same time, right? So I think in those different ways, and I think it's helped me as a scholar, especially when I'm thinking about voices and testimony, because I have that, I haven't had to learn those, but I was also an outsider, so I could, an outsider in my island of Mauritius, while it was the center of my world and that was the norm. I think being an outsider always does open one's eyes to some of the dynamics that are taking place. Some of them are very obvious. Some of them are far more subtle. So the tourist literature will tell you that, you know, Mauritius is a melting pot because we have so many different people living there, and you know, one can see the ways in which that when those lines are sort of put in the sand and don't go beyond. So I think that was very important to how I think about the sources and the testimony. I would just say, even while being super conscious of all of the dynamics that are underlying all of those, and the power structures, and what can be said and what can't be said, and the spaces in which things can be said and the spaces in which they can't be said, those were the things I just remember always being very curious about as a child and wanting to work out. I will say one other thing about perspective, though, and I think it's to do with age and experience and maturity. I could not have written Voices of the Enslaved as a young scholar. I probably wouldn't have been interested in it. I think, and I think this is something we don't talk about very often because, you know, most people go into training, you know, get their PhDs young, etc. I think one does, maybe in my case, I've written a very different book from my perspective on the complexities of human relationships, which seem so much more straightforward when I was in my 20s and 30s, and have taken on layers of complexity that I hadn't realized. So when I'm writing about a love story, perhaps it's not necessarily conveyed, but I have a very different perspective on what's going on there. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for sharing your personal story with us. I didn't know you spoke Creole, so who wants to go next?
I can go after because you're right. This does follow on the first question really well. So the other piece, so like, I guess it's funny because like it's sort of similar to Sophie. My identity, obviously, well, hopefully, obviously, Black woman. So I have a very strong interest, not necessarily because of that, because of course Black women can study anything, but for me, I do have a strong interest in thinking about where and how Black womanhood is figured historically. And I have I always come back to the history of slavery, but my origins are also part of that. So my family is Black and Puerto Rican, as well as Black and of the South, out of Alabama, and the ways that history and thinking about the role that slavery plays in either of those narratives, whether it's a Black US narrative, as in mainland US, or a Black Caribbean narrative, as in Black Puerto Rican. Those are some interesting, there are interesting conversations there that are happening across both, and there are also some interesting divergences. And nowhere in there is there a denial of Blackness or a kind of sense of Blackness as because it's bicultural, bi-ethnic, or multi-ethnic or multicultural, somehow separated from the other kinds of struggles that are happening. And yet that's sort of how mixed raceness, mixed identityness, multifarious, diverse communities get written into scholarly narratives. And so knowing that in my own background is a very interesting information for me to have when I'm thinking about how our communities of varying kinds that are also happen to all be of African descent in some capacity, whether of the continent or somewhere in the mainland US, which is incredibly diverse of African descent, or in the Caribbean, how are they relating to each other? Is important context, I think, in the same way as thinking about being able to navigate multilingual diversity of Creole, French, English, et cetera, as well as thinking about what do various kinds of witnessing and testimony mean, not just in the context of a legal record, but also to the people that are giving testimony, which is what I find so powerful about Voices of the Enslaved. And I think that those are some of the ways, that's the kind of information that can help challenge some of the more, and I'm going to say sociological, but I don't know if that's the right word, but some of the ways that in the construction of lives, of Black lives in this context, although I would also want to think with Indigenous lives in this, in their construction within historical narrative or within scholarly narrative, there's such a pressure to kind of make very clear boxes and bifurcations between experiences and across timelines and across geographies. And that actually was useful at one point, but I think is increasingly a lazier narrative, and one that is not necessarily true to the ways that time operates within Black life, Black diasporic life, but also isn't necessarily true to how people of African descent broadly experience relating to ethnicity, relating to race, relating to various polities and community and kinship. And we as scholars need to do a better job of really digging deeply into how are Africans, people of African descent, understanding their world in an organic way that actually probably butts against and it may completely destroy our assumptions, our sociological assumptions. So that's to say, my lived experience is absolutely information that I bring into thinking about how to understand a source, how to understand how individuals within the archive are potentially relating to each other, and how to understand what historiographies to bring into relationship to each other. So be clear for me that African history has to be part of the story of the diaspora, of any diaspora that I'm speaking of on the American side of the Atlantic. All of those are part of that. So.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's just so nice to get to know you a little better. So Cécile, can you hear us? I don't know if Cécile can hear us right now. Okay, so I think that Cécile will come back. So I see we have only one question in the chat, so I'd like to encourage our audience to post their questions. So let's wait for Cécile, and in the meantime, I'm going to move to the second question, to the third question, and then we can return to the second one. So we have Emily Clark to thank for this really good question. So there's been a flowering of significant scholarship on New Orleans in the past decades or so. What do you think has been most important and exciting about that trajectory? So I guess we can maybe start to address that question, and then when Cécile comes back, she can address the second question. Sounds good?
Did you say you want us to start or to wait? I missed that.
I mean, maybe we can start. What do you think? And then when she comes back, we just.
So I will start. Jessica Johnson. That's the flowering of scholarship. So, you know, you're just so brilliant, and it's just been fantastic to see you, you know, be brought into the fold of Louisiana studies. I feel like I'm an old éminence grise now, having been doing it for so long. I just want to say a few brief things about that. I mean, it's just been, it's really to do with, we're back to decentering, not leaving at the margins. I think the scholarship has been extraordinary in many ways, sometimes helped by digitization projects that have made the archives more reachable, but actually I think by you know, new scholars coming in to look at this. And I think the one important outcome for those of us, especially who've been working on this for a couple of decades, is the recognition of scholarship in Louisiana, which hasn't always been there. It's been sort of scattered, a few people that, you know, one would know. And I think that's, so almost more than individual scholarship or particular directions, I think it's seen as relevant. I like to think it's seen as relevant to broader narratives about Caribbean history, imperial history, North American history, that aren't just about this sort of place in on the Gulf Coast, or, you know, if we're looking at lower and upper Louisiana, obviously going further. So I think to me that's been one of the most important and exciting parts of what we do, the recognition and its sense of relevance, along, of course, with, you know, we've been part of Atlantic history for a while. I think that the global history aspects are some of the most exciting to me, you know, histories of religion, etc. I mean, it touches everything, but so I'll leave it there. But to me, it really is about seeing us not being quite, you know, being in demand, you know, being visible and being, you know, we're not demarginalized, we're not decentered yet, but there has been so much progress in that direction, and I think that's been possibly the most exciting, watching.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Oh, okay, Cécile is gone again. Okay. Jessica, do you think you could go ahead?
Yeah, no, I can hold it down until Cécile comes back. Thank you for the kind words, Sophie. It's funny because I feel like I'm such a huge fan of you and your work for, you know how long, and so thank you. I am very excited about the work that is really like Sophie's work, like Cécile's work, especially Cécile's work. Caribbean New Orleans is just a book. Like, it is fantastic. And I know it's part of a larger oeuvre of her work and others' work that is about much of it in French. This is why I'm excited to see more of it happening in English, because it can be broader, be used more broadly within a U.S., particularly in New Orleans context. But it's just that kind of deep, rich, intensive work that is looking at the administrative structures, that is looking at civil servants and civil, that is not the vocabulary that would be used at the time, but civil actors, military actors, how all of these are unfolding together, and is doing it with a critical eye, not for again, these kind of sociological categories of Black, white, et cetera, which again have their uses, I think, at a point, but are looking at the ways that racialization happens, the ways that difference and divestment of resources and extraction and closure happens in practice, right? Because one of the things that is great about New Orleans, but will always confound scholars who are not attuned to it, is that if you try and create boxes around categories of identity, of place, of space, of status, of large or small land, you will always be confounded. Even of empire, because New Orleans crosses 3 empires, French, Spanish, US. And so there are so many ways that studying the Gulf Coast, the Third Coast, forces historians and scholars to be incredibly critical, incredibly granular, and intricate with how they're analyzing things, the methods they're employing, and the kind of broader narratives that they then create. And that I'm very excited about. So I'm thrilled about Voices of the Enslaved, that really kind of brings us back to challenge, which is one of my favorite challenges, the Anglo-American, the Anglophone hegemony over the 19th century slave narrative and slave testimony, which is incredibly frustrating to me when I think of all the different kinds of narrative and testimony you have in a French, Spanish, Portuguese context. I'm incredibly excited about material that is getting, even more deep and granular about, how divestment and closure, racialization happens. I'm also really excited about work that I think is coming, that is going to return to New Orleans and the Gulf Coast as part of a broader Spanish-speaking context. That Spanish side of the Louisiana territory and of the Gulf Coast is a piece that has not been taken up in a kind of serious, deep, rigorous way since Jennifer Spear and before her, Kim Hanger. Kim Hanger in particular, really got into the notarial records, really got into laws around Black and Indigenous interactions. We have Jean-Pierre Glanec, who is doing work around the slave trade and the reopening of the slave trade in Spanish New Orleans, and how we don't talk about that as much as we ought to, and the kind of particularly the West Central African Congolese fusion that happens there. Ibrahim Sek's work he's working on not just the Haydels, but now also doing work with the 1811 slave revolt, and he was speaking about that at the plenary. So there's such exciting work that is going to continue to deepen this work. I'm excited about that. I'm excited about the ways that this work calls us to really bridge across French and Spanish, and hopefully French, Spanish, and US, because historiographically we sort of bound ourselves to particular language formations and historiographical priorities. And again, the Gulf Coast will never let you do that. It will never let you stay in a box. So I'm excited about the calls to move across these boundaries that have let us not see the fullness of this region. Sorry.
Jessica, I'd like to just ask, because you're one of the few, and I think Emily Clark's another one, who has looked at the French, Spanish, and sort of territorial period. You're one of the few who's done it. Why do you think? And you're right. I mean, that is the Spanish, especially, is the one that's sort of fallen off. I mean, a few people sort of, as you mentioned them, who are doing brilliant work or have done brilliant work. But why do you think that has been the case? Because it's not necessarily this is not the is it still that exoticism of the French Quarter? I mean, what do you have any sort of insights as to why the Spanish has lagged in a way and not been?
Yeah. It's funny because I think in a lot of ways there is some of the exoticization of the French period, and even
though it's a Spanish quarter built in
right, exactly. So it's the French Quarter, even though it is kind of the Spanish Quarter. As we all know, city burns down, and it's actually the Spanish architecture that we're so impressed by. Although I'm partial to the Creole cottages myself, but so I think it is some of that. I do not want to diminish the amount of work and labor that's involved, because when you add in the Spanish, you're not just adding in a new language and new documents in a different place, even within the New Orleans context. So most of the Spanish notarial records are held by the New Orleans Notarial Archives. They're not necessarily at the Old Mint. Now we're getting really detailed stuff that probably the crowd is not interested in, but we're just going to nerd out really quick. So, so you're getting into where documents are physically located. You're getting going into the actual logistics and brick and mortar mechanics of doing the research, right? And that's just in New Orleans. But then you're also talking about going to France, overseas archives in Aix-en-Provence, but then also maybe going to Madrid and Seville and checking out the overseas archives, Papeles Presidentes de Cuba that are there. You're talking about having to balance also, if you're going to do the Spanish period, you then actually have to take seriously that that slavery begins in the 1440s, 1500s. Like, it's not a thing that starts in 1619. That's not a dig at that project. I am a huge fan of that project and Nicole Hannah-Jones. Let's just be very clear. And shame on everybody who is coming down on her. But I do think that there is something different to the view of slavery and the view of empire when you're looking at it from that earlier period. And that means you have to think differently about all of these things. And I think that that has not happened from a sort of US context, certainly, because as Cécile related, we've barely sort of accepted that there's a Louisiana before the Louisiana Purchase. But I think also in the same way that Cécile also related, that New Orleans is sort of seen as this periphery of, like, super periphery of the French Empire. New Orleans is not even a blip on as far as Spanish Empire and historiography. Like, you have Cuba, you have all of the rest of the southern hemisphere, and then you maybe have some Puerto Rico and DR, and then somewhere over there is this little post that is New Orleans that is only interesting to the Spanish for about 30 years. And then, you know, they are maybe more interested in Florida for a while. So you really have all of these, both historiographic disinterest, cultural disinterest, and then the archives themselves are hard to actually physically, you know, navigate in the kind of limited time that scholars have. So there's real structural issues there. That said, what I'm excited about, and among the many things that are hopefully changing this, including advising, including grant resources that hopefully will continue to be around after COVID, is the access that scholars are having to digital resources. So the digital archives that exist, that are getting created, archives are taking more seriously now than ever, especially with COVID, having to get their materials digitized. One of the projects that I'm on with Life Code is Keywords for Black Louisiana, which I have sucked Sophie White into as well. Is working on doing digital editions and translating and transcribing colonial documents from the 18th century. And we do work in the French and Spanish. So some of this is changing, and hopefully more access will also continue to draw people into this period. But the structural barriers are incredibly real. They're not to be downplayed at all.
No, that's very important. So thank you for addressing this. So I think that Cécile is back with us.
Yes.
So Cécile, do you think you could address maybe the second question and the third one? So the third one was about the what's most important and exciting in your opinion about the trajectory, the flooring of different scholarship on New Orleans.
So for the third one, I will answer for the one before the second. I agree with what I heard about Jessica saying. I would only add that for me, the most exciting thing is the demarginalization of Louisiana history. The fact that we are able now to have an influence on, the early American, North American history, Atlantic history, French colonial history, things like that. And so I think it's a major accomplishment because for a very long time, and it's a scientific issue, but also very much a political issue. We saw the influence of the marginalization of New Orleans at the time of Hurricane Katrina, during and after. And so things are slowly changing, and I think it's very, very important. That's my main point. For the second thing, I must begin. So I must mention that as an outsider to the US academia working on a colony which was integrated in the US at the beginning of the 19th century, I've been interested in this question for a very long time. But to me, the issue is not so much the impact of identity, but of social position, the place from which we work on the scholarship we produce. And in fact, with a group of 30 European-based historians of early North America and the US, we published in 2014 a book entitled Historians Across Borders, Writing American History in a Global Age. So that's something we have been thinking a lot, in fact. And so, but I must explain that, I don't know, do you hear me or do you have a, yes, okay. So I must explain that if I'm a French-born historian who have been trained and with pursuing an academic career in France, I don't view myself, despite of my accent, as a typical French historian, because I've published extensively in both English and in French. Caribbean New Orleans was written directly in English and published in the US, or the collective volumes. So I consider in a way that I'm both a French and a US historian, in the sense that my work has been shaped by an engagement with both the French and the US academia. Both sides of this transatlantic community of scholars have influenced my work, because when I started to work on my dissertation on the Illinois country in the early 1990s, early American history or colonial studies constitute an underdeveloped, marginalized, and illegitimate historical field in France. I could not have produced the work I've done in French and then in English on early French North America without US historiography on colonization, slavery, and race. And this is especially true about race. For a very long time, French historians were very reluctant to address this issue. It was not even possible to use the term as an analytical category to analyze racial discrimination and violence. Thus, I would have been left with nothing or not much if I could not have relied on the US historiography on race. But of course, I engage with this historiography with a critical point of view, but as any scholar should do. Right now, the situation is rapidly changing in France, and I'm participating in the surge of race studies in France, but the debate is still very intense and vivid. Conversely, because I've been originally trained as a historian of early modern France, that is an ancien régime society, I can bring an understanding of ancien régime culture that is sometimes missing from the work of US historians trained only as historians of early North America. But more importantly, my research is very much informed by my training as a PhD student and then my career at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences, the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences founded by the school. Because at the École, we don't consider history as part of the humanities, but as a social science. The subtitle of Les Annales is History and Social Sciences. It means that we practice history in a transdisciplinary dialogue with sociology and anthropology. And this is the reason why I'm very much attached to social history, and that I aim at practicing a kind of social history informed by sociological and anthropological reflection and tools in order to take seriously into account the concept of colonial society and slave society. All along my career, the question that has been at the heart of my work on colonization and slavery is how people coming from various backgrounds and having opposite interests succeed to coalesce as a society, regardless of the exacerbated power of struggle and the greater tendency towards segmentation inherent to any colonial or slave society. Consequently, I always prefer to consider society as a whole and to confront the point of view of all social actors and to study how they interact across status, class, race, gender, or age line. In my view, the only way to analyze how the social order was at the same time implemented, negotiated, contested, and resisted. I believe that it's crucial to mix the micro and macro level of analysis and to analyze tensions between individuals and society, agency and structure, domination and resistance. The risk otherwise is to stand loose from a question-driven research and to weaken the heuristic power of historical writing. Finally, another dimension of the impact on our scholarship of the place from where we work has to do with the different relationships to the history and memory of colonization and slavery on both sides of the Atlantic. In the article Trevor Bernard and I published in the collective volume I mentioned, we out that when transnational history started to rise in the 1990s, as the criticism of the hegemonical framework of analysis on historical writing, US historians of early America choose to expand the list, whereas specialists of colonial history working on other colonies than the North American colonies or from outside the US prefer to develop what has been called new imperial history or a global history of colonial empires. The US
Cécile, I'm sorry to tell you, I think that your microphone is not functioning so well. Yeah, and now we can't hear you.
Elle en a marre.
There's some extremely French cussing out happening right now. I can tell.
Yeah. No, we can't hear you anymore. Sorry. I think that Cécile may have to leave and join us again. I don't know. I think she's. I don't know. I don't know how.
So Cécile may come and join us again, but one of the things that I also heard in her very important comments are the ways that in the French historiography, there is not a, let me try and think about this differently. In the ways that what we learn about who we are is also is structured in particular ways. And so I find it interesting to think about the French historiography or the French understanding of itself, the hexagon understanding of itself, as missing a kind of outre-mer component or an understanding of France as an empire that has done certain things or that is part of a certain larger slavery and colonial project. I find that really interesting in the context, in some ways, of what is happening now with this debates about what is being taught in K-12 schools, and so much of that is also, I mean, a lot of that is Louisiana is very much part of the South, in the U.S. South, in these ways, you know, like, so these conversations that are happening around, you know, so-called CRT, which is essentially like, let's not teach anything about race or difference or history, that are happening in Louisiana and Texas and Florida, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there's something to what histories are told and are sort of elevated to mainstream discourse about a place or about ourselves versus what is excised from the narrative, and how important it is to bring, you know, which is what I heard Cécile saying, how important it was to bring not just, you know, North America broadly, or the, you know, the upper Louisiana context into French imperial understandings of itself, but also, you know, the Gulf Coast, and the Gulf Coast connections to the Caribbean as also part of French imperial understandings of, you know, what it is to be French and what that has meant. So there's an interesting bridge there. I feel like I see, and a political bridge, I think, and hopefully I won't be, misreading what Cécile is saying, but that this is not, you know, kind of passive or neutral work. Like, this is very politicized work, even as at its very basic level is we're just saying what's in the archive. Like, we're not saying anything, you know, we're not doing any more than that. The document is right. Like, Sophie has the documents. The documents are right there. She gave us them in almost full text in the book. And yet there's something very political about that. And I think that I just want to kind of, you know, note that and acknowledge that, because my God, you know.
And I'm just going to give a little plug for my, the Digital Humanities Project is going to have a set number of trials in their entirety with the French manuscript, the manuscript page, the French transcription, my transcription, translation, commentary, and apparatus, right? So you'll have, for anyone who wants to see those in their entirety, they can. And I think, Jessica, also you were, as you were talking about Cécile's work, and hopefully she's back now, but you mentioned the Caribbean. Of course, the other sort of side is, you know, early on, it was sort of a lot of scholarship coming from Canada, because Louisiana, the province, was a province of New France, and so, you know, that sort of is perhaps receded, but I think is still, especially for the earlier and, you know, the founding years and conceptualizations of who can marry who, and whether Indians can become French, role of religion and skin color, etc. I think that scholarship has perhaps receded, but I think we're probably overdue a moment of reconnecting with what's taking place both in French and English, but the scholarship on New France as well.
Okay, so we're running a little late. It's fine, but I want to make sure that we'll address the questions in the chat. So we're going to move to the Q&A in the chat, and then if we have enough time, we'll address the rest of the pre-circulated questions. So the first question came from Fernine Eaton, and it is, would anyone know a source or have the information as to how many enslaved individuals were owned by free people of color in the territory of New Orleans in 1811? I ask the question because I've not seen it discussed in not one of the narratives of the 1811 German Coast events, whereas it is a significant element of the Saint-Domingue historiography. So that's the first question. And then the second question, if you want me to go ahead and just,
yeah.
I'm curious on the panel's thoughts about the material changes wrought during the Spanish period. Older generations who saw the flooring off and the possibility of African freedom in Louisiana refused to take part in the revolutionary project to dismantle it in 1795. How can we best contextualize the perspectives of enslaved people who chose not to revolt against slavery, even as the possibility of destroying the institution in Louisiana seemed imminently possible?
I don't know. I would say I published. I edited and wrote this world history of slavery, and I just wrote this piece on slave revolts all over the world in every period. And what struck me most doing it was the fact that, in fact, in every slave revolt, the rebels are always a minority. It's not a peculiarity of Louisiana at the end of the 18th century. Even during the revolutionary period, even when they could imagine that they would succeed, in fact, enslaved rebels were always a minority, because the risk of dying, of losing everything, of losing family, children, a lot of land and everything was so high, and people were struggling first and most of all to survive, and when they could, to obtain their freedom. But so for me, it's not. The main issue slave revolts had to how to expand and recruit, willingly or forcefully, other rebels.
Is that also an argument for paying less attention to revolts, or not giving them that sort of supremacy? Or
on the contrary, because it's in fact, even it's incredible the fact that slaves, the enslaved, revolted as many times as they did, despite the fact that most of the revolt failed, except for the Saint-Domingue revolt. And so, in fact, it's the contrast. It's the contrast between the failure of most revolt and the fact that it didn't prevented them to try to revolt one again and again in different circumstances, and the frequency changed over time and depending on the region and everything. But on the contrary, I think it's remarkable that they revolted as much as they did, despite this, all the odds against them.
Yeah, I want to. I definitely want to add. I agree with that completely, and I want to add to that to two things. One is that the Haitian Revolution is often set up in High Greg as a kind of iconic example of revolt, and as a successful revolt, slave revolt in particular. But it's actually a multi-layered, multi-dimensional revolt and war on many sides, many sides. Many things had to happen in order for us to end up in 1804 with Dessalines and the new constitution and the white, torn out of the flag and all of that. Which is not to say that enslaved, revolutionary action should be discounted. Same thing. I agree with Cécile. That has to be very much part of this. But it is to say that that we should not judge the other revolts and conspiracies and mechanisms of resistance by the exception. We actually can think more broadly about the different manifestations of armed resistance alongside other kinds of resistance, which brings me to the second point, which is that this also is another example of the ways that thinking about diaspora and Africans in the Americas becomes really, really important, because then we do see the ways that, the 1791 people have argued, John Thornton in particular, and have argued that the Saint-Domingue, the enslaved insurrections in Saint-Domingue, particularly in the Northern Plain, were very much an extension of Congo-Angolan insurgencies and warfare that's happening in West Central Africa. And I believe Hall has argued, and others, might join her in thinking about the 1795 revolt as a MENA conspiracy. The Poncopé revolt as a MENA conspiracy and a gathering of a particular community around that are informed by African ethnicity and African origins and histories, but their self-conscious understanding of themselves. And so what would it mean if we not only took seriously the revolts and thought of the Haitian Revolution as a kind of iconic example, but took seriously all kinds of armed insurrection, but also took seriously that the players within these revolts are also very diverse, and their claims of kinship are not necessarily ones that are prefigured on Blackness at all, or even enslaved status. And that is really rich to me. Like, that gets into an understanding of Black humanity that is much more complex and much more capacious and generative and informative than solely looking at folks as slave or even just as Black. But I think that some of those, exactly this question is a call to attend again to the African history and also to the many layers of kinship and claims of kinship within Black communities. On the 1811 question, that having a kind of clear roster of free people of color and population broadly in these years is tough, because it's the transition years. So it's not quite the US where they're starting to, where they're having kind of more regular census taking measures, and it's still there's the struggle to have good paperwork in this period. And Claiborne talks about, Claiborne feels like he's in chaos in this moment, trying to manage all these different populations, and also all the ones that are coming in from Saint-Domingue as well. So a definitive census, I'm not sure exists, but compilations of research on that do and are also beginning to be gathered even more broadly. So Ibrahim Sek, I know, is doing this work. There is, and Gwen Hall's database is another resource that I would go to try and do some of that figuring, which is available still. If you just Google Afro-Louisiana history and genealogy, all of the spreadsheets and all of that are available, and some number figuring can be done there. And I can't remember if Paul Lachance has work on free people of color in these years. I know he does a lot with that migration from Cuba to Louisiana that is the Saint-Domingue refugees, many of whom are of color, of African descent. But that also, Paul Lachance, Lachance, Paul Lachance's work might have some contours there. But hey, grad students, that's also a space to do some work. So, guys, get to it.
Thank you so much. So we are late, but I still want us to address the two last questions on the pre-socialized questions. So you can decide which one you want to answer. And so the first one is about the sources that you used in your books, the methods and the challenges that you faced. So that was the first question. And then the second one was about the field in the future. So that's the good one to end this session. So where do you see the field going in the future? And here I'm talking about studies of early New Orleans, but also Louisiana, Atlantic history, and more broadly, early French colonial history. So I'll let you decide which one you want to address.
I'll just start because I had addressed the last one somewhat when we were talking about the flowering of significant scholarship, so I'm going to leave that and just say one thing about sources, because I think it's just a perennial problem which we're not the only people to face, but it's a question of language. And Cécile publishes in French and English, outlets. I'm mostly in English, but also sometimes French. But we're dealing with sources that are French, so we've got this constant problem of not just translating scholarship, but actually translating sources. And as we know, or understanding sources, translations are, art as well as a science. There are different modalités, and things do not translate literally. And I think that's something that just sort of, it's that overriding presence. I think we all have different ways of dealing with sources, but that's one that, again, we're not the only ones dealing with it, but I think it bears reiterating and repeating, especially as we think of new scholars going into the field who, might take them a while to get to grip with the language and the paleography, and not to mention the mindset. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
Do you hear me? I would only answer the last question, and only by saying that I don't want to address French Atlantic history or American, North American history, but to say that what I wish for students working is the freedom to move from one field to the other, to the framework of analysis and to discover and to do things differently, because you see slavery and colonization differently when your framework is North American history, is the Atlantic world, or is the world. And then for me, that's been the most exciting experience, this of framework of analysis and scale of analysis all along my career. That we have been questions, but having spent 5 years on about slavery for me, it is something that method we need to develop, because it's an incredible heuristic tool. It shines. I because
Cécile, this seemed very important, so I'm really sorry that I couldn't hear all of it. I hope we can talk about this, because it seemed, very important.
I can, yeah, absolutely. And I just, as we depart, just to thank you to all of you for this conversation. It is rare that I'm able to, deeply nerd out and have such a rich, essentially transatlantic discussion of this place and this timeline. I'll do the sources question because I think the ways to think about how to tackle this archive along with the linguistic diversity, which is very, very important, as we know. I think it is really, really critical for those who are interested in kind of deeper questions of racialization, of slavery, of Black life, but also, and I meant to say this about new directions, or continued directions, not just moving into the Spanish period, but the ways that Black and Indigenous histories and studies need to be in conversation, and the ways that the Gulf Coast forces us to do that. I think that a deep knowledge and a study of Black history, of Black studies. I'm clearly making a play for African history as part of this, but having some facility and some being able to walk your way through and around Black studies scholarship is part of having a reading practice in these sources, because yes, they are written by particular white elites, absolutely. Although you do have, and I really want to stress that this is an archive. The Gulf Coast has an archive of, if we're going with this formulation of testimony and slave narrative that Sophie White puts out, you do have free people of color and even enslaved people who are laying out their testimony. So I do want to actually continue to elevate that as a challenge to the way that we understand narrative and testimony. But it is an overwhelming archive of white elite slave owners, colonial officials, et cetera, et cetera. Being able to read into that and have a reading practice that really challenges that and is attuned to Black life really requires work in Black studies, and increasingly requires work in Indigenous studies and as well. So I think that having that as part of a repertoire for any scholar who's interested in this topic or this place or this time period is going to be really, really critically important. And that's how you read. That's how you read into sources that are not meant to have you there. So.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And I think this is a fantastic way to end this panel. So please join me in thanking this amazing panel, these amazing scholars. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mélanie.
Thank you. Cécile, I noticed that you had notes from like things that you wanted to say, so don't hesitate to share them with us if you'd like to have a conversation, especially curious about that last question. Thank you so much. And then, yeah, you have lots of messages in the chat, so lots of congratulations. So I'm going to let you read them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.